Hello, and welcome back to another edition of Let's Be Perfectly Queer. I'm your host, Justine Diaz, and unfortunately, my co-host and my confidant, Mr. Randy Davis, could not be here with us, so I am running the show all by myself. I'm very, very, very excited. We have a wonderful show for you today. We have our special guest here, Miss Rachele Manett, and she is here talking to us about sex and sexuality. Hello, Rachele. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks for having me. I'm super stoked to be here.
Well, thank you so much. We are also very stoked to have you here. So let's just address the elephant in the room. Sex. It's a big word.
Yeah.
It's a big word that either people are very open to talk about, or it's very passé, very taboo for them. Let's, kind of dive right in and talk about you and what it is that you do in your life to help people with their sexual journeys.
Yeah. So, first and foremost, I am a sex educator. I work for Venus Envy. We have locations in Halifax and Ottawa. I'm located in Halifax. And I am the education coordinator. So that looks like a handful of different things. I do sort of more like formal education, lectures, workshops, things like that. Big Zoom things, webinars, etc. But I also do a lot of sort of like in-store informal education, which is really fun. I always call myself a dildo slinger. Like, yeah, I'm selling sex toys. But I think like the best part of that, and especially what sort of makes Venus Envy special, is that we really prioritize education as a part of like buying sex toys. And so people come in and they maybe expect that they want to get something, and then they have a conversation with us and they learn like 20 things, and then they're like, okay, maybe I've changed my mind, or like, no, I'm now set for sure on this thing that I wanted to buy in the first place. And so yeah, a big part of that.
That's amazing.
But we also and we also sell like lots of books and gender affirmation gear. And so, we don't just like, sexuality isn't just about like how you are actively like doing the sex,
Yeah.
It's there's so much more to it about like identity and the political pieces of it, and how that all sort of like intersects to make sexuality this very important thing for a lot of people. That often is not meant to be talked about according to our societal standards, which it's kind of fun to like just constantly be inundated with not that.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And that's the funny thing I come across very often is, as soon as you open your mouth, it's either met with, oh my God, that's so interesting, I want to hear more, or people run away like covering their ears because it's like they're afraid of their own bodies and their own sexual identities. And that's not a way to live. So let's talk about what you do to help the community kind of bridge those gaps a little bit.
Yeah. And, I have found that in the last, I don't know, I've been doing this work for like probably just shy of 10 years ish. I've been working at Venus Envy for about 5, but doing sex education more broadly for about 10 years now. And something that I'm noticing as I'm going into more like high schools and middle schools is that like the youth of today are way cooler than I was as a kid. Like, oh my gosh, they know so much more. They have all this information at their fingertips. And so there is like, when they come to me, like once I get to talk to them, they have such good questions. They are past the point of being afraid to talk about sex, and instead are like, I have these really specific questions. I read a ton of stuff online, and now I am not sure what to make of it or what's true or not. And so we get to just like unpack a lot of myths and figure out like where the truth actually lies in how people are, talking about things, exploring themselves, what safer sex looks like for folks. But where I am finding there is a little bit more hesitation is, generally speaking, people who are like my age or up, and I'm 30. And I find, and there's a middle ground there. I think it depends on like the community that you grew up in and what kind of access you've had to information in the past. But definitely like people are coming in scared, and a lot of people come to Venus Envy purposefully because they know we're kind of like the place to go for education in the city. And so rather than going to like any sex shop in Halifax, there's not a ton of them. But you know, they could choose some other ones. They usually come to us because they know we'll have a conversation. And I feel very lucky because once people come to me, they're already past the like initial part of I'm ready to talk about this. I have questions about this. I'm ready to ask. You know, definitely there's been some times where I talk to like parent groups and they're a little more on the fence. And I think for them, it's just reminding them that like their kids are going to be sexual. Like people have sexualities, and it starts from when we're very, very young. And sexuality is, again, like not just about having sex. It has to do with like these huge parts of a person, whether they have a sexuality or maybe they are asexual. Like that is still under the umbrella of like how sexuality exists. And so like the kids are going to have a sexuality regardless. And if we don't start talking to them because we feel like we're not ready, then we're probably going to miss the point of no return, essentially. Like we're going to miss the point where we can still do the education, where we can actually help people have safer sex practices, or just like know about their bodies a little bit more, know who's supposed to touch their bodies and who's not, have bodily autonomy. Yes. And that's usually where I start when it comes to like younger kids and youth and stuff, is talking about like where they get to make decisions about their own body and what consent practice looks like when you are someone who doesn't get to make a lot of decisions about your life. You have to go to school, you have to do homework, you have to eat your vegetables, you know, etc. Things that I should probably be doing more of, the eating vegetables part specifically. But you know, offering like youth a chance to explore where they get to make decisions, even in circumstances where they're like not able to have full decision-making ability, I suppose. And I think like starting from there and talking to parents about that and like caregivers and stuff can be helpful in reminding them that like, I am not going out and telling every single person to just like have sex all the time. I think there's this idea that like sex positivity means we're like always ready to have sex.
Yes.
But really it just means like, you know, understanding yourself and your wants and needs and desires, and understanding where that other people might have different wants and needs and desires from you, and figuring out a way to like be okay with some of those as long as they're not harming anybody.
Exactly. And now with that being said, let's just touch a little bit, because this is seeming to be the same narrative for a lot of different groups, whether you're talking about sex and sexuality, whether you're a drag queen reading stories to children, whether you're trans, non-binary. Like there seems to be this narrative of misinformation that we are grooming children, that we're trying to harm their children, that we're doing all these things to you know, put harm upon them, when all we are doing is trying to open their minds and let them know that this is who they are as human beings. It's okay for them to feel this way, and this is why. And if this, so that being said, what do you, as an educator, what do you feel or is an appropriate time for certain topics? Like when you're coming into a school, like what is it that you are starting off talking to children about, say in like the 3rd or 4th grade?
Yeah, so usually like I don't spend a lot of time under middle school.
Okay,
like most
so
of
like
the time,
grade
that's
6,
kind
7,
of where I
okay,
start.
yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
exactly.
Yeah.
You know, I think that like when people, especially when people kind of like come to Venus Envy to get us to do education, they're sort of like, well, this is a sex shop, so you're probably going to talk about like something a little more sex related than like the 3rd graders might need. But you know, I've like looked at like lots of different styles of sex ed curriculum, and I sort of bring what I think is best based on like some of those best practices, but also, you know, what I wish I had when I was a youth, when I was like a middle school kid and didn't know myself. And I really think that like at any age, there is something we can talk about. You know, kids as young as, well, I mean, kids at any age may be having some kind of sexual activity. And by not addressing safer ways to do that, we're just putting them in harm's way. I also usually, like in some schools, some folks have had like a little bit of education here and there. And so I usually like to ask them like what they've already been talking about in health class and what kind of things they have questions about. I love when the people that I'm talking to get to lead the conversations, because I can come in with what I think is important, but I am not existing in their experience.
Yes.
And so I would rather, say, all right, like what have you been talking about in health class lately? And are there questions that you have that you like didn't feel comfortable asking your teachers, or maybe didn't feel comfortable asking your parents? Like, I'm here and I'm ready to answer these questions, and they can be whatever you want. And if they're not comfortable, then I'll say that out loud.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it just like makes for these really good conversations where, I will talk about consent laws, of course, because especially for like young kids, I want them to know, like, to understand power dynamics, and how just because like an age dynamic exists, like there's other points of power that exist within that. And so making decisions and making choices can be harder for that. And so making sure that they can recognize when something feels not right or dangerous or scary, and know what to do about that. So we talk a lot about that. And like I'm just thinking of this like recent experience I had where the kids like wanted to know a lot about like the math of the consent laws and how that like was related to like as you get older and the math changes and how to like navigate that. And it was just like, that is not what I was thinking about when I was like 12 and 13
Absolutely
years old.
not.
I don't even remember what I was doing at 12 and 13.
Yeah.
Like I was not that, I don't know. I don't think I was that aware of like what it meant to make choices and what was safe and what was scary. And yeah, it's so different now, and it's really impressive. Like I'm just so impressed with the kids and the youth that I get to talk to. They're really, really smart, and they really know what's going on.
Absolutely.
And they will ask the questions whether or not they are like scary for me.
Oh,
But that's kind of the
absolutely.
part. Yeah.
But that's the best part. It's like you said, it's putting yourself almost in kind of those uncomfortable situations, because you need to be uncomfortable a little bit in order to open up a topic of conversation that most people don't want to talk about. Now, that being said, one of the things that I think we have a hard time with, it's great that we have, we are educating our children, but for those of us who grew up as adults, like we're adults now, but those of us as children who grew up being ashamed of our bodies and being told to hide your body. And I grew up, I was a sexual being in the mid 90s, as when I was a teenager. So my entire sexual life sexuality was, okay, so you're gay and you can't have sex unless you're completely covered in rubber, and don't touch this person and don't touch that person. But it's like, so you were afraid about sex. So now that's been ingrained into our lives. There are so many couples that have a hard time communicating about their sexual wants and desires. So tell me a little bit about what you would do to help kind of navigate a couple through a situation like that.
Yeah. So, gosh, I think like I find when I talk about consent education, like, once it gets into sort of adulthood, it's less about, we're still talking about bodily autonomy, of course, but consent really becomes this idea of like ongoing communication, making sure that each person involved in a sexual experience is getting what they need out of it, is feeling safe and secure, is having fun. Like, that's the point, right? We're supposed to enjoy it. And if we're not enjoying it, then, we should ask questions or ask for something different or offer an alternative. And so, I sort of like to start there of reminding people that they're supposed to be enjoying themselves. And if they're not, like, that's okay if they don't want to enjoy themselves. But if they do, then the next step is to offer information about how that could be better. I also always recommend that people do some exploration of themselves.
Yes.
And like masturbate. It's important to masturbate. It's like the safest sex that you can have.
You need to know your own body and what feels good for you in order to be able to communicate that to your partner.
Yeah. And there's lots of different like things that can make that complicated, especially when it comes to disability, which is like a big thing that I like. So much of my job is related to that. But we'll get to that soon, I'm sure.
Yes.
But yeah, that like, masturbating can be complicated, especially if you're not super comfortable with your body, if you don't have access to certain parts of your body, just depending on like what your mobility needs are. But in general, like, exploring in some way, I read a lot of erotica. I find like that's sort of my go-to. And like recommending that people watch porn as, try to do more like safer porn, and preferably, like with good practices around like hiring and pay and things
Yeah.
like that, ethical porn, if you will.
Yes.
But taking it, of course, as inspiration and not as an instruction manual, because that's never gonna work.
One
Yeah, it's
thing,
all
one
scripted.
one thing
Hmm?
that I have was reading about too, because I like to stay abreast on sex and sexuality because it is a huge topic of mine that I absolutely love to discuss. Is taking the time to desensitize yourself from pornography and go cerebral and be in your own brain and touch and feel your body and masturbate kind of with your eyes closed without that external stimulation of visuals, right? Because we forget that. I grew up, again, in the 90s. I didn't have porn, so like I had to jerk off to my imagination,
Yeah.
like it was just what it was. But now, people have everything at the tip of a finger, right? And like you're also saying, ethical, like safe porn. There's a huge, misconception of what reality is and what fantasy is. And, one of my favorite things was listening to a lesbian comedian talk about lesbian porn and girls with big long nails. And she's like, there is no way I am letting a woman come anywhere near me with those razors. And I'm like, oh my God, these are things that people need to talk about because they don't talk about this stuff. Now, like you were saying, we were going to talk about this topic. One of the biggest things that you focus a lot of your education on is sexuality and people with disabilities. Let's talk about that taboo little elephant. And I don't want to say taboo in a bad way because there's nothing taboo about it, but everybody makes it taboo.
For sure.
So let's
Yeah.
burst that bubble and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, first and foremost, I am disabled. Like, I'm coming to this work from community, and that feels important to address. I think that, like, a lot of disability services that exist out there are run by people who are able-bodied and neurotypical, and there's a huge power dynamic in that alone. And there tends to be, I think that also like creates a lot of taboo because decisions are made for the disability community without their input a lot of the time. And that's like very common across like a lot of North America and elsewhere. But, my lens is very much Canada mostly and a bit of the United States. And so, I came to this work sort of in the middle of becoming disabled, which was complicated. I was doing focus groups. I did a master's degree, and my research focused on people's experiences with acquired physical disabilities and how that impacted their sexuality. And it was happening to me like at that time, which was very bizarre, and I didn't mean for that to happen. But I was sitting and doing a focus group, and we were talking about things that we experienced, and we were all like sharing resources, and people were telling me some different things I should try, and I was like, wow, this is like really relatable. And I think it made the research really special. I think that, if I had been doing research as an able-bodied person, I wouldn't have gotten the same information from people. Like the answers would have been different. There's a trust that was built in a really special way. But it was intense. Like I left that focus group and was tired. It was like time for a nap.
Yeah.
It took me a really long time to do what was supposed to be a 2-year master's degree, but I was like, well, that's fine. I sort of expected to take a little extra time. But yeah, so that's where things started, I suppose. And then over the last, when did I finish my master's? Around like 2019. So over the last like 5-ish years, I'm not very good at math. That's why I became a sex educator.
That's why I'm a hairdresser and a drag queen. Yep.
Exactly. Yeah. So, over the last several years since that, I've been doing a lot of work in community. So education and a lot of consultation work with folks. So people will email, either somehow they get my email specifically, or they get the Venus Envy email, and they'll contact me and will say, I'm having this very specific issue related to how my disability is impacting my sexuality. And we'll just like talk about it for, somewhere between like 15 minutes to an hour usually. It's all free of charge for them. Like I'm not charging for that kind of stuff.
Amazing.
And we just like chat about like if a sex toy could be helpful, what are some things they could try? And I'm not a therapist, I'm an educator. I mean, I am a rec therapist, that is my background, and I am certified, but I'm like not a sex therapist. And so I make that very clear to start off with. Like I'm not here to deal with a lot of these maybe underlying conditions, but I'm here to problem solve with folks. And so we do a lot of lot of that. And it's funny, I was doing a workshop recently, and the workshop I do about sex and disability used to include this like list of what I considered like common concerns that people bring up and like possible adjustments and tips to make things easier. And then that list got like way too long because of like doing the work and being in community. People were bringing up all these like different like things that they were experiencing. And so now instead of doing workshops where I like offer the list, I sort of just ask what folks are looking to talk about. And, you know, the biggest ones, the most common ones that come up are related to like chronic pain and how to explore sex in often like a new way. You know, I often get asked like, how do you top when you have chronic pain? And I was like, well, what is your definition of topping? Because I think it used to mean one thing and it still means that, but you know, we've sort of taken it out of context now and applied new context to it, as we often do with language. And so sort of like exploring what that means and exploring what gender roles can look like when someone is not, you know, physically able to be on top anymore and things like that. I think another thing that comes up is, you know, the emotional parts of it, of course. It can be intense. Like a lot of the time, especially when it comes, I mean, especially with physical disability, there is often, you know, this disconnect from the body. Not all the time, but it comes up a lot in the work that I'm doing. And people with that disconnect are like, well, I have to connect to my body in some way to experience sexual pleasure. And I already have this disconnect. And so there's quite an intense figuring out like how to reconnect often, and sometimes that can be really empowering, but it can also be really scary and really difficult to start off with. So yeah, lots of pieces to it. I also, it's like, what do I do that's related to sex and disability? It's like it's like 80% of what I do.
Yes, and it's a very important topic of conversation and a very important like outlet for people to go into, to look at, because people automatically think, like, again, I was talking to you earlier about ableism, and like people who are able-bodied just automatically push people with physical disabilities to the side as non-sexual beings. They're still human beings. They still have wants and desires. Why is it that you are looking at them any differently? It's the same way that I equate it to people like, you know, look at before when people looked at people of color differently. Now we're looking at, you know, people who are, you know, transgender. There's this whole spectrum of human existence. At the end of it, we're still all human. We still have that human label, and that's what it is. When people remember that, then it becomes easier. But what are some, as an able-bodied person, what are some like do's and don'ts when it comes to discussing sex and sexuality with a physically disabled person?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the biggest one, and this is something that comes up a lot, where like people, you know, and this is even before we get into like the sexy part of things, where people just like want to know a lot about my body without actually having like met me first. People asking like why I use mobility aid, or like when I just say because I'm disabled, they like don't take that as an answer. They want to know my diagnosis. They want to know all these little parts of me that are not like, I don't think important for like our communication to go forward. And so, yeah, there tends to be a lot of expectation of like oversharing, and that everyone has access to every part of your body, which is like not how it works, regardless of, you know, if you're disabled or not. Like that shouldn't be an expectation. So I think the first one is like, don't ask questions that you don't need to ask, right? Like let people offer the information they want to share. I think the way that I would go about it, especially if you are like having sex with someone who has a physical disability or like a disability in general, there's lots of different versions of disability. You know, the main thing to ask is kind of like, you know, first of all, what makes you feel good? Are there like boundaries, no zones, things that I shouldn't do, which is like the conversations we should all be having all the time. I often say in a lot of the like workshops that I do, and when I'm like speaking with community and sort of like larger groups, we talk about like why disabled sex is amazing and important. And a big thing that comes out of that is that like disabled people are really creative because the world is not made for us. And I think that a lot of people who experience marginalization are very creative. But when it comes to like the physical pieces of things, disabled people often like figure out ways to do things that they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. And like that is a really useful skill to have in a sex context. Like it is, I think that we are fed this idea of like in our society of what sex is supposed to be, very, very narrow definition. And when that doesn't work for someone, and this came up a lot when I first came out as queer, when I was like, well, this definition of sex clearly doesn't fit me anymore, so I'm going to have to figure something else out. But especially when I started to experience disability, I completely changed my definition of sex. Like it just was impossible to identify with the definitions of sex that were sort of like proposed to me or like forced on me when I was younger. And so, yeah, there's, I think that any communication is important, but it's already happening in a lot of disabled sex because sex can't happen without the communication. Yes. So asking what people like, what their needs are, what their desires are, what their boundaries are, things that they maybe want to avoid. And again, these are things that can happen regardless of disability and probably should be happening. Like good ways to start the conversation and get the information that you need and not the information that you think you want because you're nosy.
Yes. And that right there, I think think about what you're going to say before you say it. Put yourself in that person's shoes first, because would you want somebody coming to you asking, it's just like sexuality in general. As a gay man, one of the things that I get is, so who's the man and who's the woman? I'm like, I'm sorry, how many times do you like to give it to your wife in the posterior? Like, and it's like literally met with, well, that's none of your business. And I turn around and go, exactly. Right? Yeah. People don't ask questions that you wouldn't want to answer yourself. That I think is most important. So just a quick couple of things. So before we wrap up with the show here, let's talk about where people can find you and the information that you like to give out to the world.
Yeah. So, I mean, first and foremost, like Venus Envy, that is the way to find me, especially if you're looking to chat about something specific. VenusEnvy.ca is our website. We are also an online store, but that's kind of like how you'll find my contact info. Also, for folks who are just looking to watch something that involves sex and disability, I hosted a show on AMI, or Accessible Media Inc. Yep. That's AMI.ca, and you can watch an entire show about sex and disability. It's called That Sex Show, and it was really fun and kind of a wild time to get to film. But yeah, that's a good way to find out more about sex and disability, and yeah, otherwise like Venus Envy and That Sex Show.
That is fantastic. And what words of encouragement or advice do you have for our viewers about their own sex and sexuality? Like, what if you had to give anybody just a brief overview of information, what little bit of information would you give them?
I think always the biggest thing is like, cut yourself some slack. We are inundated with a lot of information that is untrue, and we are not coming to our sexualities maybe under the best time frame or mind. We're fed a lot of information, and so your exploration may take 2 days, it might take 2 years. It really never ends. Like figuring out who you are and what kind of sex you want to be having and what kind of sexual being you are is a never-ending experience. And you can identify as one thing one day and change literally the next day. And that's perfectly fine, and it's perfectly reasonable. And, let yourself explore. Let yourself explore.
That's amazing. That is the tea right there. My name is Justine Diaz. Thank you for tuning in. We'll be back soon, again, with my host, Randy Davis, who was not able to be here. Rachele, again, thank you so much. We'll see you soon. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.